Shalom to everyone. I hope you're ready for a Bible study. That's what this is going to be. Buckle up, get your coffee, get your tea. We're going to talk about Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1. It doesn't get talked about much, but back in 2016, a dear brother and great friend of mine presented me with his understanding of that text. Fast forward now to 2019, and in my studies through the latter portion of the book of Galatians, I have come to see that there's a connection between Galatians 5 verse 12 and Deuteronomy 23 verse 1. At least I believe that there's a connection, and hopefully I'll prove that in this video. You can decide that for yourself. Hopefully, when we get through, you'll be able to make more sense of it. So, with that being said, let's get into the study. Long story short, on the book of Galatians, Paul is writing to Gentiles who have accepted the Messiah by faith, and he's combating a false gospel that's being taught by some influencers, either Jewish Christians or proselyte Jews. And the false teaching was that Gentile converts to the Messiah have to also convert to Judaism through circumcision in order to be forgiven, saved, hold first-class status in the community, etc. So my main point here in this intro is that Paul is combating a false teaching in the book of Galatians. The influencers held a position of leadership and authority, and they're going behind Paul with false doctrine or false teaching. In Galatians 5 verse 12, Paul writes this from the older literal King James Version: "I would they were even cut off which trouble you." The more modern literal New American Standard Bible reads, "I wish that those who are troubling you would even mutilate themselves." The translation that I predominantly use, the HCSB, reads, "I wish those who are disturbing you might also get themselves castrated." Now, the King James Version sounds the mildest of the three and is not inaccurate, but the HCSB, I believe, brings across the best sense of Paul's words. Paul is calling for the castration of those who are teaching a false gospel. Now that sounds extreme because it is extreme, but it only echoes what Paul said in the first chapter, that those teaching this false gospel are under a curse, Galatians 1, 8 through 9. He's also written that the influencers in Galatia should be cast out like the bondwoman and her son, Galatians 4, 28 through 30. So they're cursed, castrated, and cast out. That's what Paul calls for. Something tells me that he was not trying to appease the masses to join his megachurch. The Greek word translated cut off in the King James Version, mutilated, New American Standard, castrated, Holman Christian Standard, is apokopto, or a form of that word. It is defined by Thayer's Greek English lexicon as to cut off or amputate, and Strong's as to amputate reflexively by irony, to mutilate the privy parts. Vines lists Galatians 5 verse 12 as a metaphorical use of the word because they feel Paul was speaking of excommunication rather than physical castration. And some commentators take that view, but most do not. I do believe that Paul had some form of excommunication in mind, but I don't believe that Paul means less than castration in verse 12. When we look at the word in the New Testament, we find it's used 6 times. Twice in Mark 9, 43 through 45, where Yeshua says, "If your hand or foot cause you to sin, cut them off." Now, I believe that Yeshua is speaking metaphorically there, but the idea of amputating a body part is still apparent in the metaphor. Okay. Then we have John 18, 10 and 26. It's used twice of Peter literally cutting off the ear, or the right ear, of Malchus. And then in Acts 27:32, it's used of cutting off the ropes on a boat. And this use isn't speaking of amputating a body part, but we do see that it still carries the meaning of actually cutting something away. And then, of course, it's used once in Galatians 5, verse 12, in a letter where Paul has been speaking of circumcision over and over again. So it makes sense that Paul would tell the men who were pushing circumcision for salvation to just go ahead and castrate the entire male organ. Paul was upset. Ellicott's commentary for English readers, taken from BibleHub.com, sums this up nicely. It says this: the authorized version is undoubtedly wrong here. The words may mean cut themselves off, i.e. from your communion, but it seems far best to take the words with all the ancient Greek interpreters as a large majority of modern commentators, including Dr. Lightfoot, Bishop Wordsworth, as referring to an extension of the rite of circumcision, such as the Galatians might see frequently practiced by the priests of Cybele, whose worship had one of its most important centers in their country. I would they would even make themselves eunuchs. Let them carry their self-mutilation still further and not stop at circumcision. It's interesting, and I think of note, that the area of Galatia was known for a castration practice in the cult of Cybele. Cybele was said to be the daughter of Zeus and Mother Earth, born a hermaphrodite, but castrated by the gods. Reading from Craig Keener's work, a commentary on Galatians, it says, in the common myth about Cybele, Attis, a boy she loved, castrated herself. Cybele mourned for him. During her seasonal rites, her worshippers joined the mourning, and her lower-level priests followed Attis's example. Inspired by wild music, they would enter a mad frenzy and would castrate themselves in honor of the Anatolian mother goddess Cybele. This was not the only rite of the mother goddess, but it was the one that easily generated the most interest. G. Walter Hansen suggests that in Galatians 5:12, Paul may have in mind a barbaric ritual that actually took place in his day in Galatian pagan temples. The priests of Cybele, the mother goddess of the earth, castrated themselves with ritual pincers and placed their testicles in a box. Not everyone approved. When the Romans adopted the cult of Cybele, they refused to use a eunuch as priest. People regularly ridiculed the Galli, especially with regard to their self-castration. They were counted effeminate, a condition that most Mediterranean men viewed negatively for men. Although other cultic settings also include some reports of castrations, the Galli were the most visible representatives of this activity. I think the point that Keener, Hansen, and other commentators are making is that the Galatian converts to the Messiah would have been familiar with the practices in honor of Cybele in Galatia, one of which was to castrate oneself. So in bringing up castration, the minds of the Galatian converts would immediately go to this pagan practice, and they would see how Paul viewed the influencers in Galatia as committing a serious offense by comparing them to the cult of Cybele. Now, we don't get this straight from the text in Galatians, but it's never wise to dismiss the cultural context of the people who are being written to. Words and phrases that are not familiar to us now and don't really mean a whole lot in our current culture could have been recognized immediately in this past Galatian culture. So while the words in Galatians 5 verse 12 may have been a poke of comparison with the cult of Cybele, I think that there is deeper significance when we compare the Apostle Paul's words to the Torah, specifically the Septuagint Torah. In Deuteronomy 23 verse 1 or verse 2 in some versions, we read in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, "He that is fractured or mutilated in his private parts shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord." That's Brenton's translation. Next is the New English translation of the Septuagint, which says, "A castrated male and one made a eunuch shall not enter the assembly of the Lord." The word mutilated, or the phrase "one made a eunuch," is taken from the Greek base word apokopto, the same word that Paul used in Galatians 5 verse 12, in a similar context, or the same context. The King James Version, taken from the Hebrew Old Testament, renders this verse as, "He that is wounded in the stones, or hath his privy member cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord." Now my Holman Christian Standard Bible reads, "No man whose testicles have been crushed or whose penis has been cut off may enter the Lord's assembly." So the Hebrew text and the Septuagint bring across the same idea. A castrated man was not allowed to enter Yahweh's assembly or congregation. Did Paul have this in mind when he wrote Galatians 5, verse 12? What is a eunuch? The NETS used the phrase "one made a eunuch" in Deuteronomy 23, verse 1. The word eunuch is basically a transliteration of the Greek word eunuchos, meaning a bedkeeper. In the ancient world, men of high rank who had a harem, multiple wives or concubines, they would have lesser men in charge of and take care of this harem, these women, and their belongings. So these bedkeepers or eunuchs would often be castrated as a way to ensure to the king or the official that his harem would not be tainted by his workers. The word eunuchos came to be used then of a man who was born impotent or castrated by another later on in life. It can also refer to a man who chooses by grace to be celibate, dedicating his entire life to the work of the kingdom. Yeshua speaks of these three type eunuchs in Matthew 19, verse 12, reading from the HCSB. It says, "For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who were made by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves that way because of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." So based on Deuteronomy 23, verse 1, was a man born impotent or made a eunuch by someone else unfit for the kingdom? Does not being allowed to enter the assembly carry with it the idea of a church service or a community of believers? Does the physical eunuch have any chance of participation among Yahweh's people? Let's look at a text in the prophet Isaiah that I think will help us answer these questions. "Thus saith Yahweh," I'll use Yahweh in place of Lord in all capital letters, "Keep ye judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to Yahweh speak, saying, Yahweh hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith Yahweh unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant, even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to Yahweh to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon my altar, for mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. The sovereign Yahweh, which gathereth the outcast of Israel, saith, Yet will I gather others to him, beside those that are gathered unto him. Now I could write an entire paper on these verses, but here I'd just like to center in on the mention of the eunuch. Yahweh is telling the eunuch to not say to himself, Behold, I am a dry tree. The eunuch would make that declaration because he did not physically possess the semen by which he could sire or procreate physical offspring. Behold, I am a dry tree is a phrase of depression. It's a sentence which depicts the eunuch's disgust with himself. Yahweh is attempting to encourage a discouraged eunuch here. He tells the eunuchs that if they keep the Sabbaths, choose the things that please Yahweh, take hold of his covenant, that he'll give them a name in his house and within his walls that would be better than if the man were to have offspring, sons and daughters, to carry on his name. That's normally how a man's good name would carry on, by having children to follow in his righteous footsteps. This could not physically happen with a eunuch, but Yahweh would cause a righteous eunuch's name to carry on among the people, and this name is an everlasting name in the house of Yahweh, within the walls where Yahweh dwells. I take that to mean Yahweh's temple, or his tabernacle. Does this violate Torah? What about Deuteronomy 23, verse 1? Now, we could just throw it out and go with Isaiah, or we could throw out Isaiah and stick with the Torah. Some commentators think Isaiah 56 is referencing a new covenant time in which the law of Deuteronomy 23:1 has been rescinded. Now, I believe that the law of Deuteronomy 23:1 has not been rescinded or abolished, and I believe that the harmony between it and Isaiah 56 is to recognize that the congregation or assembly of Yahweh is a reference to a high-ranking official position in the nation of Israel. A eunuch, a physical eunuch, could worship Yahweh, come to the temple, partake in the Sabbaths, etc., but he could not serve in a leadership capacity among the people. Sometimes the phrase congregation or congregation of Yahweh carries with it the meaning of the entire community of the people of Israel. At other times, however, it specifies a ruling class within Israel, the elders or the judges among the people. Leviticus 4:13 through 14, and if the whole congregation of Israel sin through ignorance, and the thing be hid from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done somewhat against any of the commandments of Yahweh concerning things which should not be done, and are guilty, when the sin which they have sinned against it is known, then the congregation shall offer a young bullock for the sin and bring him before the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, we've got three uses of the English word congregation here and one use of the word assembly, and you'll notice I've placed their respective Hebrew base words in the text. The point I'd like to bring out is what I see as a difference between the one, whole congregation of Israel, and two, the eyes of the assembly. I think the text is speaking of the sin of ignorance by the whole congregation escaping the eyes of the assembly of elders. The elders are to be the ones who govern the people and look out for the people as a whole, based upon Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy chapter 1. In verse 14, where we read of the congregation offering a young bullock for sin, that could either be a reference to the whole congregation bringing an offering to the tabernacle, or it could be the assembly of priests who would physically offer the sin offering for the people. It's interesting that the word congregation in verse 14 is kahal, matching the eyes of the assembly, kahal, in verse 13, whereas the whole congregation of Israel in this instance is taken from the Hebrew word idah. Numbers 35:11 through 12, and then verses 24 through 25 read, Then ye shall appoint you cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the slayer may flee thither, which killeth any person at unawares. And they shall be unto you cities for refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer die not, until he stand before the congregation in judgment. Then the congregation shall judge between the slayer and the revenger of blood, according to these judgments. And the congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whither he was fled, and he shall abide in it unto the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil. We've got four uses of the word congregation here, and all of them are taken from the same Hebrew word edah. Edah was the word used in Leviticus 4:13 to refer to the whole congregation of Israel, but here in Numbers, it's undoubtedly referring to a specific portion out of all Israel, the elders or the judges that ruled in court cases. I don't really think the use of a different Hebrew word changes much. It would be like me using the word elder in one text that I wrote in an article, and then I used ruler or judge in another paragraph. Still can mean the same thing. So the understanding is, a person shall stand before the congregation of elders in judgment. The congregation of elders shall judge between the slayer and the revenger of blood. The congregation in Numbers here is making decisions. This is a congregation of the Lord. or a congregation of Yahweh. 1 Chronicles 28 verse 8, Now therefore in the sight of all Israel, the congregation of Yahweh, and in the audience of our Elohim or God, keep and seek for all the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, that ye may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance for your children after you forever. So you may say, why do you bring this one up, Brother Matthew? Well, here one might see the words all Israel and the congregation of the Lord to be one and the same people. I'm not sure that's the case. Other translations add additional punctuation to the text that sets the congregation of the Lord as separate in some way from all Israel. The HCSB says, So now in the sight of all Israel, comma, the assembly of the Lord, comma, and in the hearing of our God. So the placing of the comma after Israel implies that the assembly of the Lord here is the assembly of ruling elders or judges. The sequence is then the 1, Israelite people as a whole, 2, the rulers in Israel, and then 3, the Almighty. David is the speaker, and he's going through a progression of people that he's speaking to or in the sight of. And I think that's the best way to understand the congregation or the assembly of Yahweh here in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 8. Micah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields, and take them by violence, and houses, and take them away. So they oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. Therefore thus saith Yahweh, Behold, against this family do I devise an evil, from which you shall not remove your necks, neither shall you go haughtily, for this time is evil. In that day shall one take up a parable against you, and lament with a doleful lamentation, and say, We be utterly spoiled. He hath changed the portion of my people, how hath he removed it from me? Turning away he hath divided our fields. Therefore thou shalt have none that shall cast a cord by lot in the congregation of Yahweh. It appears that Yahweh is condemning people here in powerful positions, abusing their power by taking a man's belongings by force. Then notice verse 5, where it says, Thou shalt have none that shall cast a cord by lot in the congregation of Yahweh. The Septuagint reads, Therefore you will have no one to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. The Holman Christian Standard Bible reads, Therefore there will be no one in the assembly of the Lord to divide the land by casting lots. Now I think it's best here to understand the assembly of the Lord as the judicial court to apply the land in a just and equal division. The judgment was passed here upon those who were taking the people's land by force. In light of these uses of the congregation or the assembly of Yahweh in Scripture, I'd like to suggest that Deuteronomy 23 verse 1 forbids a physical eunuch from serving in an official role in Israel. This would bring harmony to Deuteronomy 23:1 and Isaiah 56, which mentions the eunuchs having a place in Yahweh's house, within his walls, the tabernacle or the temple, and even offering burnt offerings and sacrifices. Isaiah 56 verse 7. Some commentators agree. To go along with this, we have laws concerning the priesthood that forbid even a son of Aaron offering a sacrifice if he has a crushed testicle, or if his stones are broken, King James Version, Leviticus 21 verse 20. And the same can be said for what sacrifices a priest would bring. Animals with severed testicles were not allowed to be brought as a sacrifice, for they were blemished, Leviticus 22 verses 23 through 24. I began with Galatians 5:12 and I'll end with it. If my understanding of Deuteronomy 23:1 is correct, then Paul makes all the sense in the world. The reason Paul wished that those who disturbed or upset the Christian Galatians would be castrated was so that they wouldn't be in a teaching or leadership position in the first place. Paul may have been speaking somewhat hyperbolically, but he most likely had in mind the desire for the teaching privileges of the influencers or the Judaizers to be revoked by the mandate in the Torah, namely Deuteronomy 23, verse 1. I appreciate you for your time. Hopefully you've learned some things. May Yahweh bless you in your studies. Shalom.